All right, it must be a big game. We've got a double-decker, double-header of Buckeye Live edition here. We got Pat Murphy on the line to talk Ohio State football. Take your comments and questions for the next 45 minutes or so right here at the Voice of College Football. So take the opportunity and leave those comments and questions there in the live chat. Pat, how are we doing today?
Good. Did Steve do well earlier today? I told him he had to hold up the Bucknuts end of the bargain on your earlier show.
I will let the viewers make the call on that. They are the final judge on that. But no, Steve delivers every time. Hey, and Steve stuck around. I cannot talk bad about Steve ever, but especially on a day when he stuck around for the 2023 schedule release. So he stuck around to analyze that.
Yeah, which turned out to be the exact same as the schedule was before. So there really was, from an Ohio State perspective, not much difference there. I know other teams had some things changed around, but it's funny when we got the embargoed release beforehand of the schedule. I looked at it and I was like, am I crazy, or is this the same schedule as because I'd had them I'd made a chart to make them side by side, and I was like, these are the same schedule. Nothing's different here.
We still talked it up because, that's what you do. You still talk it up. Certainly, I think the NFL has done a wonderful marketing job of fooling everyone into making the NFL schedule release like a national holiday for some people. My goodness.
Yeah.
All right. We're talking Penn State and Ohio State. We'll look back at this Iowa game because I don't know that I've ever seen 54 points scored against the defense that played that well ever. So that was one of the and it shouldn't come to surprise anyone. And certainly we had you on last week to talk about this matchup against Iowa, but that they would perform that well, but somehow the dam would break and Ohio State would figure out a way to score. But we didn't expect the defense to chip in with a lot of the scoring or setting up the scoring as much as they did.
No, definitely not. And I think you did certainly see what we talked about was, as you said, kind of the dam breaking. Look, if I was talking to somebody after the game, and an Iowa fan outside the stadium, and they said, if our offense were just bad, we would be okay because that would keep the defense off the field a bit longer. I mean, you could just see, but the amount of plays that this defense has not only had to go through in that game, but this whole season, it wears this team down. And, it's a shame that such a good defensive performances, a defensive team is just kind of wasted because this offense is so bad. And I know Kirk Ferentz has really defended the group and, defended obviously his son and the coaching staff and all sorts of things, but it's a shame. And frankly, it's a travesty what's going on. You're a Big Ten team. I mean, you've got to be better than that. And, Ohio State's defense did some good things in that game, but I mean, it was as easy as a game as they've had. And, they've played some teams that weren't very good this year. So that says something about what Iowa's offense is.
Yeah. Iowa's become such a national topic because of this that
it's a laughing stock. It frankly is.
Yeah, it is. That's exactly what's happening. That I have shows and various records and so forth that have nothing to do with Iowa, and they're brought up all the time as this is what's going on at Iowa. And if somebody compares like their awful offense and say, well, we're not Iowa. And, people that pay no attention typically to Iowa football, it's just become a national narrative of what's going on there. And you're right. It's a laughing stock because I guess if they had a bad offense, they would be Illinois is what they would be right now.
Yeah.
They would be probably headed toward a Big Ten championship game.
Because
the defense is that good.
That defense, I'm not going to say it's the best in the country. I think just talent-wise, there's teams like Georgia and others that have more, 5-star kids on the roster. But with the way they play, how disciplined they are, how they know the defense so well, Phil Parker does a great job. It's got to be better than that on the other side of the ball, just to give them a chance in games. And I mean, they've had chances in games, and obviously they've won some games, but this could have been a much more interesting contest if Iowa could just have put up more than 3 offensive points. I mean, that's it. The other 7 were on that C.J. Stroud fumble return for a touchdown, and then they didn't do anything after kicking the field goal. And, I mean, good if you're an Ohio State fan, obviously, and the Buckeyes did exactly what you're supposed to do against a bad offensive team and figured out the offense against that good Iowa defense in the second half. But, it just could have been way more interesting. The Big Ten probably could have been a bit more compelling in the West if Iowa's offense is, even as good as last year. I guess the Iowa defense scored more points last year, but they were able to get to 10 wins in a Big Ten championship game. And this team is not at all on that level.
Yeah, they got to a Big Ten championship game and finished in the top 15 in the country, and their offense was number 123 last year. Now it's 131. It's inconceivable. And not to focus on Iowa, of course, we're going to talk Ohio State, Penn State, but one more thing, because it just the week to week to week, the statistics and the anomalies and everything, the aberration, it all just becomes more amusing or disgusting, but depending on your vantage point. But they almost could have just like run the ball 3 times and punted every time they had the ball. They got in the defense's way even more so than they should have with all the turnovers.
Yeah.
And of course, the defense scored their touchdown, which is just, if you knew nothing about football and said, well, this is the offense's job, is to score. They have the ball. It's easier for them to score than the defense to score, but the defense scores. It's crazy.
Yeah, not in Iowa. That's not the case there. That's just the rest of football anywhere else. I mean, I saw a statistic. I was trying to pull it up here. I saw it on social media somewhere. But, like, if Iowa had just punted on first down every time they got the ball, their field position would have been better. They would have limited Ohio State from getting the ball in plus territory multiple times. And the defense might have been able to score more points. It was kind of a breakdown. It was an interesting way of looking at it. And that may have been the best strategy for Iowa. And, I can't speak to all of their other games. I haven't watched it. But, on the Ohio State side of things, you mentioned, 6 turnovers is obviously a season high. I think that's 4 straight games. Ohio State has at least 1 turnover now. The credit to the Buckeyes to some degree. You didn't allow Iowa's offense to find anything at all. And I think that's important, because if Iowa's offense had scored a touchdown, if they'd even have really a sustained drive, I don't think they had a first down until sometime in the second quarter. If you allow that, then maybe some doubt starts creeping in about this defense, because most of the offenses they faced haven't been very good. And if you somehow allow an Iowa team coming off a bye week to concoct a way to move the ball, maybe you do allow some of that confidence for them, doubt for you. But they didn't. And, 6 turnovers is impressive in college football, no matter who you're playing. And, they return 1 for a touchdown. Obviously, the others set up, quite a few points. What was it? Points off turnovers were 19 for Ohio State. So that's obviously the touchdown. And then some of the field goals Ohio State had. That's taking advantage of what you're given. Ohio State's defense can only play the teams on the schedule. They continue to do it well. So I think that, as much as Iowa's offense played into Ohio State's dominant day defensively, you have to credit them for going out and getting the job done very effectively.
Yeah, I think you can look at the turnovers and you can put some of them in the category of gifts, but you can also credit the Ohio State defense for roughly half or 4 out of the 6 as saying they took the ball away. They made a play on the ball. They stripped it. We've got an Iowa show where a former Iowa assistant coach, Don Patterson's on, and he pretty much went through the turnovers and said, yeah, that was a gift. Obviously, the bad snap or the fumbled snap, those sorts of things. But there were also, he certainly said, hey, there's a great defensive play. He's well coached. He's well schooled in how to strip the ball, breaking on the ball, making those plays on defense. So, a tremendous effort by the Ohio State defense in that one. Pat, as we spin this forward to Penn State, the thing that stands out to me is that I can't imagine, with the success that Travion Henderson and Mayan Williams have had in their careers. Obviously, we've seen what they've done in college. They've never experienced a day individually or collectively as a rushing offense like they did Saturday. And then obviously they tore it up in high school. They've probably, I can almost guarantee, have never experienced a day where they couldn't run the ball.
Yeah, it was a weird one. I mean, you ended Gay with 66 total rushing yards. Travion Henderson 11 for 38. Mayan Williams 10 for 19. That's 3.5 and 1.9 yards per carry respectively. Look, some of this is a credit to Iowa's defense. In fact, I'd say a good amount of it is a credit to Iowa's defense. They wanted to stop the run. I mean, that was certainly part of the game plan there. And they frustrated CJ Stroud too, but we can get to that later. And I just think if you're Ohio State, now you have something to look at and say, okay, we've been running the ball well. That was a goal coming into the season. The first 6 games, we did a good job with it. The offensive line played well. I also put some of this on the coaching staff. Some of these run plays were obviously things Iowa saw on tape that they felt that, okay, here's how we're going to handle it. And I don't know if they adjusted enough to get the run game going the way maybe it needed to. Now, obviously, it doesn't matter. You pull away in the second half. Most of that comes from the passing attack. But I do think this will be a game that you need to look back on and continue to build upon because, look, let's be honest here. When you get down the road, you play a Michigan team, maybe not in the Big Ten championship game. It depends who they play there, but certainly possibly a college football playoff. We've seen before if Ohio State becomes too one-dimensional at that level, it generally doesn't go well. You have to be able to run the ball, pass the ball. And it's not just Ohio State. Everybody has to do that. If you're facing a Georgia, they're going to look at what Iowa did. And Ohio State's offense needs to be able to find some other things that maybe don't show up on tape or things that you can do better blocking up front. They did have some stuff where pulled the center, pulled the guard that led to some things. Maybe the numbers look a little bit better if Travion Henderson doesn't slip on that run. I think it was in the second quarter. He may have gone for a touchdown there. But overall, it was just not a good running day. And I think everyone from the coaches down to the players, all phases of it, should take the blame for that one. And, again, it doesn't ultimately matter because you win by 44 points. But it is something that I imagine at Ohio State they will be taking a closer look at.
Folks, we got Pat Murphy here from Bucknuts 247 Sports. We appreciate Pat stopping by for another Buckeyes live edition here. So join Pat at Bucknuts. Check out his work. And we'll be here for the next half hour or so taking your comments and questions. And yes, somebody had mentioned in the chat that my Buckeye fandom was coming out today with the 2 Buckeye. We're doing a Penn State live tonight at 8:30. So we're giving equal time there with our boys from SB Nation. So we appreciate them stopping by. All right. Ohio State, from a public perception standpoint, almost can't win. They're expected to dominate everyone. And even the likes of Penn State, we had people giving scores in our Buckeyes show a few hours ago, and everything was 42-7, 56-10, just complete disregard for Penn State. Okay, I know that Penn State went to Michigan. They stayed in the game full into the third quarter, even though they weren't playing well. They were getting dominated, but they 2 broken plays, basically, 1 offense, 1 defense, kept them in the game. But I think we focused too much on one showing, 1 performance, 1 game. They were on the road. They were at Michigan. Sure, they got whipped, but I don't necessarily think that's Penn State. I think this is an extremely talented team. Sure, they have their flaws. I don't know that they're an elite team, but they're almost definitely the 3rd best team in the Big Ten, unless Illinois' got something to say about it. They're the 3rd best team in the Big Ten, and I think they're a force to be reckoned with, and they have like talent to Michigan.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, look, this game could certainly get away from Penn State in the same way that the Michigan game did, just because of turnovers, things like that. I mean, if Ohio State's able to hit some big plays, Michigan obviously did it on the ground. You would think more than likely Ohio State would do it through the air, but Penn State has some defensive backs who are very talented. It'll be probably maybe Iowa as well, but the toughest test in terms of like-for-like talent, matching up receivers and defensive backs that Ohio State's seen this year. Maybe Notre Dame, though that was a weird game because you lose Jackson Smith and Jigba, and that changed the game plan. offensively, Penn State has weapons. Sean Clifford, up and down. That's been his whole career. He's had at least one big game against Ohio State. Now, I think he threw for over 300 yards, but threw it 50 some times in that game. But the stats still look good. So he's able to do some things with his legs. We've seen Ohio State already this year against Toledo struggle with a quarterback who can move the ball on the ground and make guys miss, make throws downfield. Sean Clifford's certainly capable of doing that. I'm of the belief that this Penn State team would be better if you went to Drew Aller. I think he's just the better quarterback, but you can't argue with what Sean Clifford did last week against Minnesota, right? So there's certainly reasons to believe that Penn State can give the Buckeyes the game. But then you look at what Ohio State just keeps doing week after week. And, I think the question is, how do you stop this Buckeye offense? Iowa did a good job of frustrating Ohio State, frustrating C.J. Stroud, making him have to get off his spots, making him make some ill-advised throws, including the interception. So, there are ways to slow it down. But then you look at the final numbers, and C.J. Stroud still throws for 286 yards and 4 touchdowns. And these receivers, you still have three guys over 60 yards, 3 guys with touchdowns, and that's with Jackson Smith and Jigba leaving the game in the second quarter. So, I think that it certainly will be interesting going to Beaver Stadium. I have never been there for a game that wasn't a night game and a whiteout. It'll be interesting to see what the atmosphere is, because I do think that generally plays into the game. Now, I imagine Penn State fans will just get up early and begin the tailgates earlier, and it'll still be a raucous environment. But I do think that changes things a little bit in Ohio State's favor. I don't know if this game will be any sort of blowout. Penn State tends to keep it close against Ohio State, especially in State College. But look, I can see why Ohio State fans are confident right now. It would be hard not to be. But this is a Penn State team that does have as much like-for-like talent as maybe Notre Dame in week 1. And obviously Ohio State was still able to pull away and win that one by 11. And that was at home. So we'll see for sure. But I still think Ohio State just ultimately out-talents a Penn State team this weekend and eventually probably pulls away a little bit.
Michigan fans won't want to hear this. And, of course, credit, they won last year's game. But over the course of Jim Harbaugh / James Franklin's tenures, which only miss by a year, Franklin started in 14, Harbaugh in 15. Penn State has been the closer team to Ohio State year after year after year. They won the game in 16. Those 17 and 18 games were big leads that they blew that went down to the wire. All the games were competitive. So they have played Ohio State better. Now, James Franklin's, what are we looking at? 14 through 21, 8 games. He's won in 7. So the final result in the win-loss column is not pretty, but it's always, you got to go back to 2015 was a blowout for the Buckeyes. But besides that, double overtime game, even in the national championship season of 2014, Penn State has been the closest program to Ohio State consistently. Somebody brought it up earlier. I did not hear James Franklin's response, but I've brought it up from time to time because we're working on like 4 or 5 years since James Franklin, after an Ohio State loss, one of those excruciating losses, termed his program as a great program and Ohio State as an elite program, and we need to get to where they are. Well, he kind of put himself on notice to say, the underlying tone sounded like we are going to get there. Well, that's been a long time now. And I don't know if great was the term that he should have used for his program. They're really good, but they're not quite what I would term great.
Yeah. He was asked about that this week. And, he said they're still working towards that, I think was more or less the answer he gave in significantly more words than that. But yeah, I think you just, you can start with recruiting and see where Penn State's recruiting rankings are. And I know that not everyone buys into that, and you can certainly excel above your recruiting rankings. And I think you've seen Big Ten teams do that in the past, Michigan State being the prime example when they were the most, the biggest challenge to Ohio State for a few years. But you look at the recruiting rankings, and then you look at the way Ohio State has developed the players since they've come on. You look at the guys they've sent to the NFL, and there's just a difference right now. It's there's no way around it. You mentioned playing a team close. That's all great, and going to double overtime and all that. But I think if you ask Penn State fans about being close against Ohio State, that doesn't make you feel any better, because you want to get over the hump, be on that same level as the Buckeyes, be in the college football playoff, be winning Big Ten championships. And look, Penn State, and I'm not going to speak for Penn State fans, but my perception of it and for the Penn State program is that this is their rivalry game. There isn't another in-state school that they play every year. There isn't another team that they love, from my understanding, beating more than the Buckeyes. So I think that plays into it too, and why sometimes these games maybe are closer than even the records reflect, because it's like any rivalry game. They bring it on at another level. And I think Ohio State, obviously Ohio State's rivals Michigan. There's no doubt about that. But it's almost like Michigan and Michigan State. Ohio State certainly recognizes Penn State as a rival competitor in this conference and in this division. There's no doubt about that. I think if you ask any Buckeye player, any Buckeye coach, any Buckeye fan, they'll say our only rival is Michigan. But I think Ohio State fans enjoy beating Penn State quite a bit. I think the players recognize how good the guys on the other side of the ball are. A lot of them played together, be it in high school or camps or things like that. So they understand what the talent level is there. And there is that back and forth hatred, but respect between these two programs.
Yeah, rivalries are born or created in a number of ways.
Yeah.
And two of the most obvious ones are geographic location and then conference/division affiliation, where you're competing for the same championship year after year after year.
Yeah.
And then
having good games against each other. I mean, you need that history. You can't just create a rivalry just because teams are close or whatnot. You need some sort of history, and there's been some of that. There's been plenty of that between Ohio State and Penn State. Steve did a story just the other day on Bucknuts that goes back and details the rivalry all the way back to the beginning between Penn State and Ohio State. So people aren't familiar, I recommend checking that out because he does a great job with those. But there's even going way back, not just within these past handful of years we've been talking about. You go back to Terrell Pryor and when Penn State came into Ohio Stadium and won. I mean, you can go way back, even pre-Big Ten, when Penn State wasn't in the Big Ten. There are some games that were interesting. So, yeah, there's quite a history there.
What's interesting to me about this matchup is I'm a big believer that the old adage, you win in the trenches, generally holds up, even in the modern game where the ball gets out of the quarterback's hands quicker and you minimize the trench play in some occasions. But what I like about this matchup is, so you mentioned Penn State secondary, and I think they've got the best secondary in the Big Ten. Joey Porter, Jair Brown, they got great players back there. And this is a defense that lost 6 players to the NFL draft last year, and they're going to have a slew more go off of this defense, whether it be this season or next season. And we know what the wide receiver room is at Ohio State. So those guys going at it. And then on the flip side, I don't know if there's a KJ Hamler. I don't know if there's a Jahan Dotson, but Parker Washington's a really good player. Mitchell Tinsley's an accomplished player. The tight end, of course, Brenton Strong's another Brenton Strange in the long list of Penn State tight ends against an Ohio State secondary that I'm not going to give the accolades to that I am the Penn State secondary. So that might be one of the few or only Penn State advantage, at least on paper, it appears going into the game, their wide receiver matchups against an Ohio State secondary that's a bit thin and banged up.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the stats, Penn State is number 79 in the country, pass defense allowing 232.9 yards per game. But you look at Pro Football Focus and the way they grade Penn State's pass coverage, number 38 in the country. So that's the
one thing I'll say to that, Pat, I know I checked this before they played Minnesota, and Minnesota didn't pass it, but Penn State was also giving up the most pass attempts per game Their
Sure.
efficiency was like 7th in the country in
Yeah.
pass efficiency. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that will be a very interesting matchup because, look, we all know how talented this Ohio State passing attack is. You know the weapons. We'll see what is going on with Jackson Smith and Jigba and how much, if I assume he will play, but how much if he does. But you know you've got all these weapons out there. You've got C.J. Stroud, but you know I will be interested to see if they can do some of the things Iowa was able to do when they were able to frustrate C.J. Stroud. You know there was a stretch in that game against Ohio State where he struggled. I think he completed just like 5 of 10 passes or something in the second quarter going into the third, which is very un-CJ Stroud like. There were some throws. I mean, CJ Stroud was lucky to not throw 3 interceptions against Iowa. He obviously threw the one, had one called back because of offsetting penalties, and then had another that should have been intercepted, and Iowa just couldn't come down with it. So, you know, the stats turn out to be fine, but it could have been a different day for CJ Stroud. I don't think he will have the same issues 2 games in a row. But like you said, this defense will test them. I don't think Penn State will be scared of Ohio State's receiving core, you know, as talented as it is. Yeah, obviously, again, you know, you can do it for so long. Eventually, does the dam break again? But it'll definitely be the biggest challenge they've received. They being Ohio State's receiving core, that the passing attack, all of that.
Pat, I believe we are just 1 week away, meaning this weekend's games. And then is it the next Tuesday that the College Football Playoff Selection Committee releases its first edition?
Yeah, I think so. November 1st is the date that sticks out in my head. So, yeah, I think that's right.
There we are. So this obviously is going to be huge for the Buckeyes. If you get your head on straight, you just win the game. That's the important thing. If they win the games, if they win them all by 1 point, they're going to be in the playoff. But of course, there's a lot of positioning, and there's a lot about, you know, evaluating the performance. And then, of course, the comparison to what did Michigan do against Penn State, which was pretty darn impressive. So here we are with Ohio State. But do you have any thoughts about the way the rankings and the polls look in this stretch drive for the Buckeyes?
Yeah, I've said for the last few weeks now, if Ohio State continues to play the way that it has, I don't know how you don't have them number 1 in the college football playoff rankings. Like the AP poll and the coaches poll, it's usually pretty simple. You move a team up, move a team down, depending on wins, loss. Sometimes, you know, a Tennessee win over Alabama obviously grabs people's attention and things like that. But for the most part, Ohio State and Georgia, you're not going to change too much there. If Ohio State goes into State College and wins the way that they have the last several weeks against a Penn State team who, you know, I imagine the committee will have in the top 20, regardless of the loss, you know, assuming Ohio State wins, then I can't see how you put anyone ahead of Ohio State just given their resume. I mean, look, you look at Georgia. They almost lost at Missouri. They had a strange game against Kent State. You look at Tennessee. Yeah, they have the huge win against Alabama, but they had at least 1, if not 2, close games. I mean, everyone in this top 5, 6 picture has either had a close game, had one of those questionable games, Michigan included. You know, Maryland had that comeback that made things interesting into the fourth quarter. Ohio State hasn't had that. And this will be the biggest test for sure. This will be, you know, the number 13 team in the country, if you believe the AP polls. So if they can do that again and come out of State College relatively clean, then, you know, they on paper are the best team in the country. Now, obviously the committee looks at a lot of different things. There's a number of different people in that room. So we'll see how it pans out. But in my mind, you know, this is a test to be that first number 1 team. Now, that doesn't mean anything to the end of the season. I will say too, just while we're talking about the rankings, and I think I've said it while talking with you before, I'm always really interested in these first rankings. The rest of the rankings are interesting, but not nearly as, because I think this sets the tone for what the committee is looking for, what this group, because it changes every year, what they're most interested in, what they're most ranking teams by, that type of thing. And you usually hear phrases from the committee chair that stick throughout the next several weeks. And you can kind of then get a sense of, okay, what do these teams need to do? And I'm not talking about undefeated Ohio State, but maybe if once we get to, I assume we'll get to some one-loss teams starting to creep in and being in that picture, what do how do you separate the one-loss teams? What is the committee judging teams on? So that's why I think these first rankings are interesting. Not that they dictate what it'll look like at the end in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, but how the committee's evaluating teams and what matters the most for this group.
We have just enough meat on the schedule right now with 7 games played that there is some semblance of a path that you can look at for various teams, but there's not enough there. Obviously, there's going to be so much separation with teams meeting head to head, Georgia, Tennessee, Ohio State, Michigan, on and on and on, that you're going to have that, because you can draw up some crazy scenarios right now. And it's fun to think about, oh, if Illinois wins the rest of their games, they're 12-1, they're the Big Ten champion.
There's a scenario where Northwestern, I saw this on Twitter the other day, where Northwestern could be in the Big Ten championship game. And that includes losing to Ohio State. Obviously, that's a not a division opponent, but imagine
so
they're
that. 1-3. So they're 1-3. Northwestern's 1-3. They would lose to Ohio State. They run the table otherwise. They're 5-4. Because that was fairly easy, not easy to see, but there's such a log jam in that that the winner, there could be some kind of crazy 4-way tie at 5-4.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, other teams would have to lose and it would have to work in their favor. But yeah, just you're talking about interesting scenarios. Ohio State or Michigan, whichever one's undefeated, probably against Northwestern in the Big Ten championship game. And
Northwestern, who would be 5-7.
Yeah. And that would continue the trend of even years Northwestern making the Big Ten championship game, which I think goes back like 6 years now or something.
Yeah, I love it. I would love to see that. The one that hit me the other day was on a national scale that Wake Forest, who will be favored in the rest of their games, not significantly, probably will trip up. But if they run the table, they're 11-1, but they won't go to the ACC championship game because they lost to Clemson head-to-head, but 11-1 with a double overtime loss to a Clemson team that's probably going to be undefeated and in the playoff. I don't think they'll get the nod, but they could gripe and scream and people could actually point to them and say, why not?
Yeah, that would be certainly, it'd be like when Ohio State made it over Penn State. I mean, not that they would make it over Clemson, but just it would certainly bring up conversation. And again, that's when I think you start looking at what the committee values, what matters the most to the committee this year. And, that could play a part in that scenario, for instance.
And we both know that if we could get into that committee room, that it would be fascinating because they're not all together on these. There are probably some great arguments, and it probably runs all the way from one end of the spectrum of the geeks, the nerds, breaking down statistically, this is what this tells me, therefore this is what I'm going with because they're 1, they're 2, because these metrics say, to the other end of the spectrum where it's just simply like, I watch football, I know football, I'm telling you that regardless of what happened last week in that game, I'm telling you that they're better than them. So you probably have just these arguments that range all over the place.
Yeah, well, and that's why you have people from different backgrounds in there, right? Like, just to make it interesting and to have those conversations. I think if you just, picked former coaches or former players or whatever, you'd get a very succinct ranking, but you may not get what's best. Look, I was happy with the computer polls. I thought that was great.
You liked those, huh?
Yeah, I mean, look, you set an algorithm, you let a non-biased computer program determine it. What good is technology if we don't use it? No, I'm halfway kidding. I think you need people involved for sure. I never had a major issue with the BCS. I think more often than not, the BCS got the right 2 teams into the national championship game. I do like that it's more inclusive now. I like that there is an extra set of games. I like that personally I've gotten to go to these playoff semifinals that I may not have been able to cover before. So, the format as it's changed has been good. But it is interesting to think. I know on 247 Sports, one of our national guys starts to put out, and I think he did it last week, what the BCS rankings would look like. And it is interesting to kind of compare that in terms of how the computers would have evaluated these teams in comparison to once we start getting the college football playoff rankings, how they're evaluating the teams.
I've railed on the BCS, but probably in a sense, if I was really upfront about my complete take, it's not so much about the BCS as it was about only selecting 2 teams.
Yeah.
Because I always saw teams that were left out. I didn't have an issue for the most part. I could point out some years. Didn't have an issue with the teams that were selected, but I thought that there was always 1 team or 2 teams that had just as good a resume as one of the teams that was selected. Therefore, we needed a playoff for those teams to meet.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think, and especially you look at other American sports, this is the way it's done, right? You give teams a chance. And I think you're going to see that with the playoff expansion. More teams are going to get an opportunity. Now, whether that's about actually giving teams opportunity or having more games to make more money, we could debate that. But ultimately, it will give more teams an opportunity. Now, I think more often than not, is that going to change the teams in the national championship, Final Four picture? Probably not. I think you'll probably see the same group of teams. It'll be a little bit wider, but I don't think you'll see NCAA basketball type Cinderella run that you do in that sport, just because they're such different sports, and the way things will work out. I think even if there is an upset in the first round, it's unlikely the team will make this incredible run to winning a national championship. But you're also not having 64 teams in there, so they are all higher level teams, so to speak.
There's also a thought process that this will even accentuate the SEC's stranglehold, even though it would seem to be and is more inclusive. But if you include 4 SEC teams into a playoff bracket of 12, then there is also that possibility that they all just win.
Yeah, that's certainly possible. I think some years that would definitely be the case, that they would at least be favored. I think there's some years where the SEC lives on reputation more than actual strength of teams. I think where that could certainly be a better chance of happening is if Texas and Oklahoma, come into the SEC strong, as opposed to where they've been this year and last year, where they've kind of fallen off. The high pedestal that Oklahoma had, and obviously Texas has had its struggles. But if they can get back to that elite level, that adds to the strength of what the SEC could do in that type of setting. But you look at UCLA and USC, and I think USC for sure is on an upward trajectory under Lincoln Riley. UCLA, we'll see if this is a sustainable thing now under Chip Kelly or not. But I think those are the 2 conferences that seem to benefit the most in my mind, with the SEC probably a little bit ahead of the Big Ten.
So before I cut you loose on this question, I'm going to be asking you, is the Big Ten down? And I'll say this first, that on face value, it appears to me that it is. Wisconsin's down, Michigan State's down. Typical teams that are top 15 to 25 in the nation are down, and they're not even close to that. We see a few other teams emerging, but maybe not taking their place: Maryland, Illinois. At the same time, there are so few meaningful non-conference games that you don't have to be a mathematician to know that once the conferences start playing each other, they all go 500. So every game's won and lost. Yeah. It's just about the distribution and how that's interpreted. Outside the league, the Big Ten went about 500. I don't remember the exact number, but it's like 5-5, 5-6, something like that. Michigan State going out to Washington and getting blasted looks bad. Wisconsin losing to Washington State, because we had they were both ranked in the top 15 in the country at that time, but they've now come back to the Big Ten and gotten whipped by the Big Ten. So that almost verifies that, okay, we thought they were good, and then, the Big Ten's not that good because 2 of the better teams are losing. non-conference games. Well, they've come back to the Big Ten, and they're not any good against the Big Ten either. So I don't know that the conference is down as much as it's just that expected top teams are down, and maybe aside from Ohio State, Michigan, and maybe Penn State, it's just everyone's just feasting on each other and cannibalizing the entire league.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the year, and I'd have to go back and look at how the records were and everything. But the year in the SEC when Ole Miss and Mississippi State were both, I think, top two, and they were 1 and 2 or 1 and 3. Yeah,
that was the first playoff poll.
Yeah, so that wasn't the strongest year in the SEC. Obviously, Alabama makes the college football playoff, but I think because it isn't the names, and because programs like Illinois and Maryland aren't teams that have all of a sudden just shot up recruiting rankings, and you can see, because we look at so many people look at recruiting to kind of figure out how teams are going to be. It's kind of, okay, well, the Big Ten's down. These teams that are doing well in the Big Ten, especially the Big Ten West, aren't that good. I agree with you, though. I think, and we'll see come bowl season a little bit, but maybe Illinois has started to develop some of the players that were there. Brett Bielema has been pretty good at developing guys. Maybe Maryland, just because those are the two teams you looked at, have started to find some things. And not that they recruit poorly. I mean, Maryland's gotten some players, especially on offense. Obviously, they have a quarterback who, when healthy, is pretty good. Maybe they've started to develop too. And yeah, it's not your traditional names at the top of the Big Ten, especially Big Ten West. But I think that with the way Illinois is playing defense right now, they would give a lot of teams a run for money. Now, are they going to go and really challenge Alabama? No. But I don't think they'll give Ohio State a huge challenge if that's the matchup in the Big Ten championship game. Same thing if it's Michigan. I think, you'll see eventually, as we were talking about with the Iowa game last week, you'll see talent prevail in those games. But yeah, I agree with you. I think a lot of times when it's not the recognized powerhouses, the historic names, teams that haven't been there before, there's that perception of, oh, this conference is down, whereas that may or may not be the case.
Where with the SEC, it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy to a certain extent. They generally back it up, and I've got to give the league credit for winning big games out of conference, usually, not always looking that great in bowl season, but the top end of the conference kind of lifts the rest of it up. And we always go into these seasons just thinking they're good, and therefore they get the benefit of the doubt, and the rankings almost reflect.
Right.
And when teams win and lose, okay, well, they lost to them, so we're going to keep them in the rankings because they lost to another SEC team. Well, it's almost, again, self-fulfilling that way.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at the preseason rankings, and that sets the tone, right? And people say they aren't important, but it does kind of set the expectation for teams and for conferences and whatnot going into a season. And then, like you said, because typically the SEC has 5, 6, sometimes 7 teams ranked in the preseason or early season rankings, then yeah, it does affect kind of where you view that loss, as opposed to maybe in Illinois. Now, maybe Illinois is not a good example because I don't think anyone saw that coming, but like a Maryland is not that surprising of having a good season. I mean, they've been building something under Mike Locksley, and as I said, they have talent. So, I think we just, especially with the way the rankings are done, the AP poll, the coaches poll is a little bit ridiculous, but I think a lot of times you just put the same teams somewhere in there and look, okay, if just for an example, if Penn State isn't expected to be as talented this year, okay, maybe I rank them 20 as opposed to 12, and maybe there should be a deeper dive into where these teams actually look like they're going to be. Or, and I know that I'm not the first one to come up with this idea, maybe we don't have preseason rankings. And there'll always be some sort of preseason rankings, even if it's just odds makers coming out with odds for teams. That happens in every sport. There's power rankings, there's whatever. But I do think in college football, it does set an idea more than, say, the NFL, where yeah, the Kansas City Chiefs are going to be good, and generally what teams are going to be good. But I think teams would view things a little bit differently if you didn't have those. And obviously, the NFL is different. You have divisions and standings and all that, so it's not a like for like
All
comparison.
objective.
Yeah.
You can be the Kansas City Chiefs, and every power poll in the country can say that you're the best team in the NFL. But if you start 2-2, you're 2-2 in your division, and you're not going to make the playoffs if you don't start winning.
Look at the Buccaneers this year. I mean, everyone expected Tom Brady to come back and be great, and they're 3-3 or 3-4, whatever it is.
3-4, just like the Packers.
Yep.
Aaron Rodgers. Pat, is there any particular work that you would like to point people to this week?
Yeah, I'm currently working on a story. I sort of touched on it there about C.J. Stroud and the Iowa game. I think there's some reflection of, look, C.J. Stroud's a great quarterback. There's no doubt about that. He's 1 or 2 in the Heisman right now, depending on who you talk to, and there's a good chance he wins it. But we evaluate Ohio State and C.J. Stroud on an elite level, right? And against Iowa, I think it was kind of a microcosm of what he is. He can be very, very good most of the time, but there are still some flaws in his game, especially when he's not comfortable in the pocket, able to set his feet, when he has to move a lot. If it's under pressure, I think sometimes you see some issues. And so that's kind of what the story's looking at. Also, in how he responded against Iowa to have that second half and really put on a CJ Stroud-like show. Look, he's going to be evaluated. Everything's going to be dissected after this season when he heads to the NFL draft. So that's kind of what I'm looking at is where he can continue to get better and how he has continued to get better that way.
All right, folks, we have just dropped the link to Pat's work there in the live chat. So check it out right there on Bucknuts 247 Sports. Pat, we appreciate you stopping by. Know that you've got a ton going on. Enjoy the trip to Happy Valley. It's one of the great sites in college football, of course. Pat, enjoy the weekend, and we will see you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark.